Have you ever wondered about the importance of race and children? Should there be a discussion or should we protect them and leave them in the dark? A recent article in apa.org states that delays in these crucial conversations could make it more challenging to change children's misconceptions or racist beliefs, said study co-author Jessica Sullivan, PhD. She's an associate professor of psychology at the Skidmore College. You might also be wondering what this has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. That illustrates that children can think about complex topics at a very young age. Even if adults don't talk to kids about race, children will work to make sense of their world and develop their ideas, which may be inaccurate or detrimental. We are excited to have you here with us today. This conversation is going to be on fire. I'm looking forward to you meeting my guest today. We value your feedback and opinions. Please drop them in the chat. We intend to respond to as many comments and questions from our audience. This takes effort and a great deal of effort at that to pull off. So I'm eternally grateful to all of my loyal guests. Every week, we create new content and we look forward to you subscribing to our YouTube channel to keep up with us. My name is Rochelle Carrier, and I'm a DEI consultant and authoress of Emotional Intelligence, a toolkit for managing DEI. And the link to purchase the ebook will be in the comments. And for a living, I help organizations and thought-provoking leaders implement DEI plans and reframe their cultural mindsets through workshops and webinars. Join us as we continue to share the different voices in the DEI space. Dr. Jacqueline Douget is a pediatrician, writer, speaker, podcast host, founder, and content creator with demonstrated leadership in child health, public health, and health equity. Dr. Douget is an expert on school-based health, the impact of racism on children's health, and helping parents talk to children about race and racism. She has a passion for achieving child health equity and social justice. Recently, Dr. Douget returned to private pediatric practice. Dr. Douget, thank you so much and welcome. I'd like to allow you the occasion to welcome yourself, in a distinctive way, and we want to get to know you.
Oh, thank you. I'm excited to join you for this conversation, a very important conversation. So as you you stated my bio, and I really couldn't probably do a better job. But I think but I would really like to tell people, like, I'm excited about this work. I'm excited about the work to help create a better future, right? Because you posed the question about why this conversation is relevant to DEI. And I think it's relevant to DEI because our thoughts about race, who we are, who others are, start very early. And we have the opportunity, right, if we want to change systems, they're individuals that change systems, right? So if we can create a better, if we can help our kids think critically about race, about who they are in the world, how they perceive other people, lead with empathy, compassion, and kindness, I think that we have the opportunity to create and help navigate kids through these difficult conversations and help them navigate growing up and having this just be a normal part of their existence. DEI work, it'll just be normal.
Right. And is this something, to give us a little deeper background, is this something that are these discussions that you had with your children?
Oh, yes. And this was even, I think, before really fully understanding the impact of this idea of put it this way, this idea of racial development, right? So being a pediatrician, those who are in education, we know about developmental milestones and events for our kids, right? When they learn to walk, read, get introduced to certain foods, run, right? Learn math, all these developmental milestones. But there's also there's a development of a racial identity. just as we have a development of who we are in terms of our gender identity and other forms of our identity. So, growing up in the 70s and 80s, right, my parents had to have the conversations with me about being Black, right, and really instilling that love of who I am, our culture. Um, but as you get older, you start to think, okay, well, the next generation, it should be easier, right? I'm not anticipating having to have the same conversations with my kids. It's kind of naive, right, to think that. Um, but it happens, right? You can't escape when you live within systems that are the foundation of structural racism. You can't escape not having these conversations. And I think the first time, having these conversations with our kids, probably a little bit after the beginning of school, right? So entering kindergarten, first grade, having conversations, but also knowing, based on my background, what my parents did, right? This idea of exposing our children to our culture, right? So very, very intentional about the artwork in the home, um, letting them know about historical figures, and making sure we had as much as we could, a diverse friend group, so that they could see our friends and colleagues, right, who are successful, they're Black and successful. Um, but also, but just also having a diverse friend network and social network also, without really starting those conversations or being intentional about having those conversations, but being intentional about letting our kids know that they are loved and seen, and about who they are, to prepare them.
Right. So so that's a conversation that you started with your children. So you started that conversation early on with your
Yes.
children?
Yes.
And how are they today? Would you think? I mean, now they're navigating race
Mhm.
all the time, I would imagine.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, right, to see the evolution of your children. Um, and again, this developmental approach that, I sort of take, right? Each stage of the conversation was different, right? I'm not We weren't talking to our 4-year-old and 5-year-olds about, oh, systemic racism. Um, but as they got older, and I think the really insightful period of time, right? And I start to really realize when started to have more conversations, more specific conversations, was after Trayvon Martin's death. Because if I remember right, 2015, 2016, right? Um, my oldest, now I have to go back. He's 23, but again, they were teenagers. Okay, so they were teenagers. So I have two sons, and that really sparked more conversation, right? And then, of course, all the stories that came out, right, afterwards, about more black men and women, and specifically young adults or adolescents, right, who were being murdered by police encounters. So, we couldn't avoid those conversations. It was in the news, it was in social media. And so you start to really see all the things that you've helped, all the conversations we've had leading up to that, to then be able to hear their insights, their perspectives, and then you also having to explore for yourself, okay, wow, they know more um than I would have thought, right? The way that they've processed it, the way that they want to find out ways to, how can I make a difference and change, right? Up until, again, that evolution of, you know um the gun shooting, the school shooting, right? It's not related to racism, but again, it's starting. You start to see this activism, right? You start to see this need to, um how do we make this right? All right, what can we do about it? And then really wanting to think about, okay, where is my role in this? identifying as a Black man, identifying, you know, owning their culture, owning who they are, and bringing that into um, who they are and how and who they're becoming, if that makes sense, right? So it's this evolution, and ultimately I'm like, it's not even a pride. I think I'm positive and I'm hopeful, knowing that, you know, we help navigate them through these difficult periods of time, and they're going to have more difficult times, right? But I think as a family, right, and as parents, all we can do really is, you know, love them, support them, help them navigate, you know, provide resources for them when they need resources, and help them, you know, as they are critically thinking about these issues. Um, again, it's really that navigation and seeing that evolution of who they are as human beings. And I love I always say I love my kids. I love the men that they are and that they're becoming.
How did the murder of George Floyd affect them?
Oh, I mean, I think they'd have to, you know, from what I've seen from the outside, I mean, I think it deeply affected them.
Mm,
My younger son, you know, participated in a local Black Lives Matter march, and
mm,
invited, you know, like, oh, your mom and dad, you know, we're going to the march, right? So again, that activism, that
mm,
wanting to say that, you know what, this is not fair, this is not just, things need to change, and how can I
mm,
help be a part of that change?
right. So, you know, as we have this conversation, you're definitely saying that it's really important to talk about race with kids. And you mentioned, starting from kindergarten, grade 1, and that's where my daughter is at right now. So she's 7 and she's in grade 1. And is she 7? Yeah, she's 7. She's in grade 1. And, I didn't realize that she was forming her unconscious biases until I was faced with, w- with something that was so overt and blatant, innocent on her part. But I had to take a couple of breaths to understand what it was that, she was displaying, because at such a young age, I didn't think it was even possible. So, like you said, I mean, in my household, we didn't miss, and we just, we had to work and work harder and be accomplished. Given the fact we're from a, Haitian background, also, I think that coupled with it, and my parents left Haiti in the 60s. They went to Boston, where they went to school, where I was born, and then I went to Montreal. I was 4 or 5. So even when they left Boston, because there was a lot of, it was in the 60s, it was very tumultuous times. KKK was thriving, and they went through a plethora of insults throughout their whole time there while they were attending university. There were very few Blacks attending that particular Ivy League university. So when my grandfather realized that there were things going on, decided to sponsor them to come to Montreal. And I think because they had to continuously deal with it, that it became a normal part of life. So it's not something that we spoke about. But when my daughter started speaking about it and realizing that, her skin tone was different than everybody else's, her hair was different than everybody else's, then, like you said, there was definitely more Black artwork in my household. All the princess books went in the trash, and I literally had to, or recycled. I literally had to look and find books that were more geared to her, to children who look like her. There's princess books that I didn't even know had Black princesses. Um, The Princess and the Pea. That's, again, all the characters are Black and brown. And I think that's when her biases started to change. And I had to start developing a conversation, because I realized she understood and intrinsically made her own decisions, right? based on what she saw. And based on what she saw, it she didn't see Black and brown people in the best of lights, when we go to the grocery store, or if she didn't see them as professionals. So like you, I have to intentionally, expose her to my Black and brown friends who are doctors or pediatricians or surgeons, or so she sees that those are her role models. And yes, this is achievable irrespective of your color, but especially because of your color.
And I think, from, like you're saying, right, this, watching your children's experience or your child's experience dealing with and questioning who they are in relation to other people, right? It starts you to think differently, right? And also, forces a conversation. But I think to your point earlier in the introduction, right, there is an opportunity for us to even start even earlier. And I think sometimes we think about, or what I've heard from people, right, is that I don't want to have the conversation too early, right? I want to maintain the innocence of my child, right? Not expose them to the negativity. And I can understand that, right? And I think to a certain degree, my husband and I had a conversation um a little while back, and he brought to light, my ideas of how to have these conversations and when to have these conversations about, their racial identity, they identify as Black, right? I It was different, right? I think I definitely was more on the, like, let's hold off a little bit having those conversations. But then you realize you can't, right? There's a point, like, but there are ways, I think, to do it, to have the conversation, so it may not be so explicitly heavy, right? And I think the ideas that you have about, diversifying your bookshelf, right? Because if kids don't see themselves reflected in the books or the media, then, like you said, they start to create other stories, right? Who's important? Who's normal? Right? And I think even we do that still as adults, right? When we see, it's almost like FOMO, right? Like, oh, not a fear of missing out, but this idea, right? This, you see a certain color hair, a certain body type, a certain size, and that's normal for us, and that's what we're trying to achieve, without having the understanding that, what, you are beautiful in your difference, as well as there are some commonality. So, and again, I think that's what we do as parents, right? I think we try to build up our children, and I think we can do that without necessarily explicitly talking about race, but we're starting to plant the seeds, right? Diverse books, being intentional about what media you consume, and I know later on we're going to talk about resources. But again, there are things we can do early. Like, let's say, if you have a girlfriend or a guy friend who's going to have children, right? When you think about what baby gifts to give them, to gift them, why not, you can talk with them about their ideas of books, right? You can introduce your favorite book to them, right? So that might be one way to help them start to diversify their bookshelves. So I think there are things we can do fairly early and start to build, the scaffolding to help our kids navigate the issue of race and racism.
Right. I agree. I wholeheartedly agree. I have to say there's been a big difference. She's 7, and it was, I think, her first experience, she was 3. She could barely put words together, but she was definitely pointing fingers. And, I had to really understand what it was that she was doing until I had, you know, so in essence, what it was, we went to so I have to give a little bit of context so the audience understands. So I had, at that time, we were all living in a predominantly white neighborhood. And she was attending a private school. And the school also she was the only Black child. And so there was already questions, why is my hair curly? Why, when I was born, my hair was straight and then now it became curly? Um, is there something that I could do she was 3. Like, how can I straighten my hair, mommy? Um, and then if we'd go to Broadway shows, and this is where it all came together. We went to a Broadway show, and I don't remember what the name of it was. And there were 4 dogs. So one was dressed in green, one was dressed in red, yellow, and I don't remember the other color. And we were sitting down, and she took her little finger, and then she's like, "I don't like him." And then I thought about it, and I said, "Dogs are so sweet." I said, "But this character, he's helping his other dog friends." And then I went about going through the process of why this was a great character. And then she kept telling me, "No, mommy, I don't like this dog." And I still couldn't understand. So a couple of days later, I had to process the information. My process is about 2 to 3 days. So I had to process. And as I'm processing the information, I was shocked. So now when I look back, the red dog was dark-skinned. And so fast forward 3 days, and I'm in shock. So I'm thinking, I am going to introduce her to an image or a picture of family members and see what she says. And again, this is before I removed, the books and, transitioned to, different types of media. And then sure enough, she said they were all ugly. And I said, "Well, what is it about them that you find ugly?" And then she took her finger and then she pointed to her skin. And I realized that's when the conversation had to begin. And then that's when I literally overhauled all the princess books, diversified her bookshelf from top to bottom. Um, now she only has brown dolls that she plays with. And so, like you said, now it's representing her. So now her narrative has changed. The other day I asked her, I said, "Who are you proud to be?" And she goes, "A brown girl." Before it was like, "Well, I don't know. I'm thinking about it." And now it's, I hope it's a little bit more ingrained. And then like your sons, I hope that she's able to navigate, you know, those situations more effectively and more actively, and to be um and to address and to be able to call out situations when they do happen. And I even went to the extent of taking her out of the school that she was at, and I put her in a completely diverse school where 50% of the population is Haitian. It's a French school, and she's now she understands where she comes from, because now it gives her a bit of background, and now she has more pride in who she is.
Oh, I think that's an amazing what you've done. One, in terms of helping her, and the change um, that's resulted as a result of you engage, leaning into, I mean, it's difficult, right? I know the first time my sons told me that one of their friends used the N word, right? It was like, okay, like, oh, what, you're like, your heart melts, right? Um, but you gotta figure out, like, okay, what to do, right? Help them process it, and also you kind of going through the process. And I think, I think you do the best you can in the situation and with the resources that you have. But I think the fact that you engage with your daughter to have those conversations, right? Again, this is like the scaffolding. We start early to have conversations. We let our kids know that it's okay to have these conversations. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to lean in to learn more, be curious, right? And I was thinking as I'm preparing for this, right? That Ted Lasso quote, that's a quote from someone else, be curious, not judgmental,
Mm,
right? Like it's like I think it's so relevant to what we do, right? Because I think for some parents, right, you hear the stories about, oh, my daughter pointed to someone and said, oh, their skin is black and my skin is this color, right? And then a parent might feel embarrassed, right, in a situation because it's in a store and you're like, oh, you want to shush them. But it's kind of like, you know what? I think it's good kids are curious and ask questions, right? There's a way to navigate that. You know what, you might want to tell them, right, you know what, that's important that you notice that, right? They're beautiful, right? Doesn't she have beautiful skin? And just like your skin is beautiful, we all have different shades, and that's what makes us unique and special. Are there other different things that you're noticing, right? You can kind of make a game out of it instead of just, you know again, your reaction is what your kids will model, right? Okay, maybe it's not good to talk about that, right? Or there might be a better appropriate time, right? You can just say, you know what, we'll talk after you leave the store. You may want to talk about it, depending on, because it can be crazy with a kid in a grocery store. But again, you're leaning into the conversation, right? You're not shying away from it. And if
right,
you don't have the answers, where can you go get those answers, right? Where can
right,
you find support so that you can have these conversations with your children?
right. And what resources, would you suggest to help talk about race with children?
Oh yeah, I think since 2020, since George Floyd, I think there's
Mhm.
been a plethora of more. I mean, there are definitely more resources for parents. So,
Right.
we talked a little bit about, you talked about media, right? You changed the books, refreshed the library, right? Her bookshelf. So I think great resources are Common Sense Media. They now have a diversity and inclusion sort of checklist as well on their site, right? So they know the value, right, of diversity and inclusion. So they have, list of books, podcasts. So I'll give a shout out for my new podcast, Henry's Libraries for Kids 5 to 8, STEM based storytelling. Um, and we talk about diverse books there, or recommend diverse books. So Common Sense Media is a great resource. The Brown Bookshelf
Oh,
is a website, and they during Black History Month they feature a new book every month, but throughout the year they feature Black and Brown authors. Um, we Need Diverse Books has a list of book resources as well.
I'm gonna write these down. So unique, diverse books.
So we need WEN
Oh,
We Need Diverse Books.
we need diverse books. So I can
Mhm.
drop things in the chat. We need
Okay.
diverse books. Okay.
The Brown Bookshelf.
I like that. The brown bookshelf. And then you said, what was your podcast?
It's called Henry's Library.
Henry's Library. Okay.
And then another great resource is Common Sense Media, which really goes over, a lot of different media, books, documentaries, movies, podcasts, video games. So that's a
Okay.
really great resource. Then I would also, lean into, the school, because a lot of school systems
Mm,
have had to
yeah.
address these issues, right? Your pediatrician or healthcare provider. And then I'd say friends and family.
Right.
And then, for
Family.
each and then
Mhm.
for each stage that your child is in, some of these resources are still applicable to different age groups. Very young preschool, PBSC and Sesame Street have
Yeah.
great resources. And as kids get older, I mean, I think Common Sense Media is a good resource. The Brown Bookshelf for different books. We Need Diverse Books.
Oh, this is great. I'm going to dive into these myself. This is amazing. I think it's really important to have these resources available to us so we can help our children, navigate race and gender, either in their workspace or, in family settings. We have to be honest, some of our family members have unconscious biases of their own. So it's important to know that it's not just in the workplace or at school. It could be in the family as well. Mary Walton, thank you so much for joining. She constantly comes in on the show, and she says here, Dr. Duget, she says, my daughter went through this for many years, being the only brown girl in her peer group. We lived in an area that was largely white early on, but became more diverse in time. I noticed she kept wanting me to straighten her hair because the friend group would be wearing messy buns. That's when I recognized a conversation had to happen. When she was in her teens, she did a video about her experience as a Black girl and not recognizing Black role models. It wasn't until she had to complete school. Okay. She had, to complete school. I don't know what she meant at the end or what she wanted to say at the end, but this is definitely an experience that Mary went through, and she realized that a conversation had to happen.
Yes, and I love the fact, right, through those conversations, Mary, that you've had with your daughter. I mean, look at the incredible woman she's becoming, right? She's taking her experiences, right, to help, I think, to help maybe help process what she went through, but also she'll help so many other young women, right, that have had similar experiences. I mean, it's difficult, right? I mean, I think I mean, it is difficult, right? When you hear that your child is experiencing racism or experiencing bullying or any sort of discrimination. I mean, the instinct is like, okay, you want to be the mama bear, right? And it's like, okay, let me just shut this all down, right? But they
Right.
have to, it's the world that we live in. And I think I just wanted to go back a little bit. We talked about something, this protective factor, right? When we talk about race, it's really a protective factor for our kids, right? When we talk about um, instilling pride in our children about who they are, right? Their culture, their language, all that they are, we're really, providing them sort of like an armor in a way, not in a bad way, right? But again, over time, we know that studies show that when we instill this sense of pride in our kids, right, they're less likely to experience depression, low self-esteem, right? So it is protective, probably more so as a child becomes an adolescent, but having those continued conversations and leaning in when they ask questions, or even you starting the conversation, makes a difference. It's so important. It is so important because, again, why would we want our kids to navigate the world unprepared? Like, we teach our kids how to drive, right? They have driving lessons. We go through the process and tell them about, don't use your cell phone. That's important. And even with race, it's the same thing. We're helping our kids navigate an important way of living in the world. So
Right.
I love what you did, Mary. I think that was great.
Yeah, I
Tough
think so
conversation,
too.
but it's important.
Absolutely. How would you have a conversation with children that are multiracial?
Oh, that's a really good question, and I've gotten that question a lot. Um, I'd say, I think first and foremost, when I've had people ask me that question about addressing multiculturalism for children, a lot of the times I've had the concern is I may be the parent that's a different ethnicity or culture as my child, right? So let's say, and like, how am I going to talk with them about being someone that I'm not, right? Not having that shared experience, lived experience. Okay, let's say you have a white parent or even an Asian parent who has a child who might be Black or Indigenous, right? So you've already been acculturated in a particular culture, so you may not identify how your child might be perceived in the world, right? So I think first and foremost, I think it's okay to acknowledge that you may not be prepared, right, to talk about a different culture, or maybe how your child might be perceived, right, racially or ethnically. But there are ways that you can learn, right, and lean into it. Teach them what you know about your culture. Okay. So again, my husband is Haitian, your family, family's Haitian, but I also have family members that are Guyanese. I'm also biracial as well. So, and I've told my kids that, like, we introduce them to Haitian food, Haitian art, Haitian culture, Guyanese food culture, um, the British stuff, not so much, right? Like but they're, they watch Premier Soccer. So I think they're, and they watch Ted Lasso. So
Right.
I think so you lean in, right, and share the experiences, cultural experiences, right, depending on what, like, are there festivals that are in your community, right, local museums, documentaries, right, books. If you speak multiple languages in the home, you know can you lean into learning the languages that your family speaks, reading books with those languages, those characters. So again, I think there are ways to have starting the conversations without necessarily being explicitly about race, but celebrating who they are and their uniqueness. And as they grow up, and you can have more in-depth conversations with them, right? Developmentally appropriate conversations. Then there might be conversations about how do they look, right? There are some people who might say that, those who are multiracial can identify as multiracial, but some people may not perceive them as multiracial, right? Depending, because there's colorism, right? People have this notion of what someone is supposed to look like because of who the parent is or not, right? So that's another function of racism, right?
Right.
We're told we're not who we say we are, right? So I think
Right.
you have to be upfront with your kids about that. There are going to be people who may not think that you are who you are, right?
Right.
Because of the way you look. And also
Right.
be okay as a parent that kids' ideas of who they are racially may be fluid.
Maybe
Okay,
fluid.
correct. And I think that's a developmental process, right? A child, so like I'll give myself for an example, right? I grew up Black, identifying as Black. I learned later on that I'm biracial. So there's a period of time where I leaned into the fact that I'm a biracial Black woman. All right, and what my culture is. But when I was younger, there was no biracial Black. I was Black, right? So and I think even with young people, the identity might change, and then what ethnic group or racial group or cultural group they're interested in might change, right? Again, who they live with and who they're exposed to might change. As they get into college, they may want to explore certain the Black Student Union, the Caribbean Student Union, the Asian American associations, right? So that they can learn more about their other identities. So again, this idea of who they are might change, but we need to lean into those conversations and have them celebrate all of who they are and who they
Right.
who they identify, who they decide to identify as. If
Right.
that makes sense.
And it's funny because you're triggering me left and right.
Oh,
So the you've touched many great points, and my daughter's biracial. So it's funny. So I'll go back a little bit. There's a friend of mine whose father is British, and her late father is British, and her late mom was Haitian. And her mom, she's more than 40 now today, my one of my very good friends. And one of the things that always stood out with me, so she's fair, she's got freckles, broad nose, beautiful lips, curly hair. And her mother always told her that when people see you, they will identify you as Black because of your negroid features, your curly hair. That's how they will see you. And that's how she identifies herself. So although she had biracial parents, her mom said, "This is how people are going to view you." So when and then you mentioned, celebrating the different shades of brown. So my daughter being, d- a, de- a lighter shade of brown, when she was transitioning or going through her process, I actually had to be very honest with her. I said, "Well, my love," I said, when they and I literally said that to her. She was 4 or 5, and I said, "Well, people look at you." I said, "They'll see me when we go out. They'll see me." And I said, "Mommy's black, and they'll notice your broad nose and your full lips." And I said, "They're already going to have a preconceived idea of who you are." So it's interesting how you're saying to embrace all the cultures. I'm not so sure I'm not so sure that I've celebrated her other half because I'm so concerned that she'll forget who she is. Yeah.
And I think that's a real fear, right? I think it's a real fear. And yeah, it's a real fear.
Yeah.
I think you, as a parent, right, you do the best you can in terms of what stage your child is in, right?
Right.
And I think we do as parents, where we prepare our kids for what the world will say about them or how the world
Mm.
might treat them, right?
Right. Right.
And then, but the thing is that you're aware of the fact that she may have I would just say, as she grows older and you may have to let her lead the conversation as she
Right.
becomes more curious about, right, being open to that idea of her wanting to explore other parts of who she is. So that's why I make this sense, like, in terms of like this fluidity a little bit, right?
Right.
As kids learn more, as they develop more, right, they're going to have deeper questions, and just being open to having those conversations, I think, is important. But I think, you're doing what you can, right, to protect her right now. And then and you're leaning into the conversations and just being open to having further conversations that may come up over time.
Right. To be open to the idea. Because like you said, she's very curious. And like you
Mhm.
said, there's going to be deeper conversations that'll help
Yes.
her lean into idea. And I have to be open to her leaning to wherever she wants to lean, to explore, to be able to have a broader understanding of who she is. Right. Interesting. The Mary, again, thank you, Mary, so much for tuning in. She says, "That's a great question, Rochelle. I recently had a conversation with a biracial friend who said people don't understand the position she faces, especially given the world we live in now. She said to stand up for one side of who she is to stand against the other side of who she is. I never considered that." Wow.
And I think I think this is why, again, I think another reason having these important conversations, right? Because I think our world creates this black and white dichotomy, right?
Right.
It's either black or white. And unfortunately, in those conversations, there's a potential to erase other people's, right? Other
Mhm.
people's experiences. Um, but also too, when we talk about identity, and we talk about how we come into this world, being respectful of how a person identifies and where they are on their journey, right? Meeting them where they are on their journey. I
Right.
mean, I can totally understand. I mean, without knowing I was biracial growing up, you know, I think for me it was a little bit easier not knowing I was biracial till later,
Right.
right? So, but it caused a lot of issues finding out later, right? Unpacking all that stuff.
Of
But
course.
so that's why I think it probably would have been better if I heard earlier. But but your parents do the best that they can at the time, and I think that's probably why I lean into the work so much, right? Because I think race has been so critical for who I am, leaning into knowing who I am culturally, having that sort of foundation when others questioned who I was or what I could be, stilled me, right? So I'm happy that my dad did everything possible to say, you're Black and proud, right? Um, but those conversations about those other parts of who I am, and there was a period of time where I leaned more into identifying as biracial, even though other people may not have understood why I did that. Giving me the space to do it made the difference, right? You may not have to understand. You want to seek to be heard and then understand. um and just giving people space to be who they are, I think, is so important. And even with our kids, right? Because again, they will change, our kids change, right?
Right.
And how they identify may also change over time, and just being open to have those conversations, and listening, right? And
Right.
respecting.
Right. Yeah. It's it's to grow with them.
Of course.
Right. So as they change, it's like a flower. As they change and they blossom, you have to blossom and change and be receptive to them as well, so that that conversation can open up, and allowing them to be who they are. Like you said, I think that's very, very critical, is allowing them to be who they are.
And but what's also interesting too, Rochelle, is what I'm also learning as well, right? As adults, many of us have childhood issues or trauma. We have not, we had no one to talk to. We had
Right.
no way to process this, and we processed it we found some way to make it through. And I think for
Right.
some parents, they may need additional help, right? To try to figure out their idea, their construct of what they think their child should be,
Right.
and understanding where that comes from, right? Where those expectations come from, where that
Mhm.
mindset comes from, and maybe having to work through themselves who they are, right? So that they can also give to their children. So that's the other thing too. I think, this is a generational thing, right? When we talk with our kids, there's also an opportunity. Let's not forget about ourselves, and some of the learning and unlearning we may have to do, and processes we may have to go through, so that we can show up whole for ourselves, for our loved ones, right, for our children. So there's still sometimes work that we need to do as adults, right, to deal with these issues, these childhood traumas we may have experienced because of race and racism, to be able to talk with our kids about it.
I agree. I completely agree. And I think the when George Floyd was murdered 2 years ago, I was 48. And I have to be very honest, all my racial experiences came to surface. All of them, everything I had gone through in the last 35 years surfaced, and I had to go through my own process. And I remember there were times where I couldn't handle her questions because I was still going through my process of understanding what I had gone through, the experiences I had lived, not being allowed to go on the city bus, saying that, my sisters, I remember the bus driver told my sister her money was dirty. This is in Montreal, barely 30 years ago. And, my parents waiting for hours and hours to be served at a high-end luxury store. I mean, those are things that I had literally forgotten about, driving across the border from Montreal to Vermont and being stopped every single time with German shepherds. And I can remember police swarming our cars, dismantling our car, and leaving it in shambles for my dad to put together again every single time, I think for 12 years. And those like you said, those are things I had to come to terms with, but I only came to terms with them 2 years ago. And that process, I had to go through my own process. I went through an angry phase, and then I went through a very sad phase, and then I went through a who am I phase. And then I had to bridge all of it together and give birth to this new person with those experiences. And then that's what made the conversations with my daughter easier.
Oh, that's amazing. I think, I'm sorry that you had to go through that. But it's very, very common experiences, right? That whether you're Black or, we know that there's a rise in anti-Asian, AAPI hate, the history of indigenous people in this country. Um, you know, it's it is systemic, right? The experiences are systemic. But again, these opportunities to make change, right? To make
Absolutely.
better, to build better, um, to build stronger children, right? And I always get quotes, the Frederick Douglass quote about it's better, building better, stronger children, right? um, is so important. And I think the work that's done and the work that you're doing to really have conversations about this important topic, I think will have ripple effects.
Right.
Um,
Absolutely. It was such a pleasure to have this discussion. I know we could probably go on and do another podcast about this because I think it's really, really important that those conversations happen and that we can continuously, and you said it, that we can continuously show up as our authentic selves, to be able to not erase a certain part of ourselves to be somebody else, or to, one of our shows was to code switch. We did that show last year, so we don't have to code switch. I think code switching is a way of surviving and assimilating, to be able to be accepted by, the dominant culture. And that's something that I had lived with for a very long time, until I learned the term again 2 years ago. And this is what I was doing. I was literally code switching. So it falls, and like you said, it comes in, colorism is another form of racism. There are microaggressions, and there's so much that falls into the realm of DEI. But it's, again, an amazing conversation. I love that we did this together.
Thank you so much. I mean, again, I just want to give parents hope, right? I think they can do this. They talk to the kids all the time about difficult topics, and it's
Right.
important, right? This is important work that we're doing to help our kids navigate these important issues.
Right. Oh, we have someone here, Lindsay Morton. Thank you, Lindsay, for showing up. She said, Rochelle, you mentioned you didn't want your daughter losing who she was when embracing her other half, which is so true. And I also think parents of biracial children are afraid to lose sight of yourselves in your children as well, which is as equally scary, especially for the BIPOC community. You want to see your children embrace the sides of them for so long, for as long as society hadn't allowed folks to embrace. As a white mother to a biracial child, I am making it my duty to provide that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so important, right? I think again, but it goes back to what, our previous conversation, right?
Right,
Leaning into these conversations with our kids and helping them navigate questions that they have about who they are and who they're becoming.
right.
Um, but I but I also think too, when parents acknowledge what they don't know,
Mm,
that's also as powerful as, so instead of, I think, thinking of us coming into a situation in a deficit, there's opportunity, right? We can learn and grow together, right? You have questions, I don't have the answers to them now, but I can find out. We can explore it together. So again, you
right,
model for your kids, and they also get a chance to learn, and you learn as well. But I think, Lindsay, I think what you're doing is wonderful. One, you're even engaging in the conversations. You have an understanding. You're leaning into this important issue, and your daughter's going to be um, so much the better for it. I mean, it
right,
doesn't protect them from everything, right? Unfortunately, we can't do that as parents, but I think we give our children a better head start, better foundation, so that they can, when the time comes, they can better cope and
Right.
deal with situations or learn where to find the help or who to talk to, right? Because we've already normalized that it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to talk about these topics. It's okay to be who you are, right?
Right. Absolutely. It's been such a pleasure. As we reach the top of the Diversity Connects Us hour, I hope you all enjoyed this conversation. I want to encourage you to connect with Dr. Jacqueline Duget on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for all the information you shared. It was a great pleasure to have you. This podcast highlights lived experiences and inspirational stories of strength and tenacity. We will share profound and courageous dialogues that influence diversity, equity, inclusion by breaking the barriers and labels of stereotypes, confronting biases, and offering best practices to achieve a more significant and cultural mindset. Stay tuned on April 5th with Felicia Ward as we talk about DEI and marketing. Dr. Duget, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure.